Oggetti socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta
A Conversation With is hosted by Prisca Arosio.
My name is Friedemann E. Neumann. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Göttingen. I'm an anthropologist, and until recently, I was a scientific coordinator in the research project on the materiality of forced migration. What I'm working on is basically asylum reception, refugees, home and home cultures, and I conduct this research by applying lens on material objects.
So the reason actually why we invited you today, it was related, of course, to the research project you mentioned, materiality of forced migration, and then your contribution on that. So if you could maybe start saying what is the project about, what are the stories behind, and how did you also collect the different information you have on your website?
The research project on the material of forced migration is a cooperation between the anthropology department of the University of Göttingen, but also Friedland Museum, which is a museum, is next to a refugee camp, and the museum works on historical migrations to Germany. And then also part of the project is the exhibition agency Die Exponauten. The Exponauts, and they're Berlin-based, and they are quite an outstanding agency in terms of setting up, designing exhibitions. And what we were doing in the project was to take a look at material culture of forced migration. What we mean by that is that not only looking at the objects of refugees, but also on things that are related to migration within society. So it's also about the debate within the receiving countries on migration and the conditions of migration. So it's not just what people have in their pockets, but it's also way broader. If you look at things from that perspective, we try to broaden the angle on that.
What you're trying to say is that you have a little bit of a wider approach than just looking at objects.
Yeah, we're looking at objects, but the relation to objects is not just personal, but you always have a social component to it. There's an economic component to it. So you can look at things, but I think what is important is not to lose sight of the broader conditions of the setting you're looking at.
You said that this project, it's a collaboration between the university and the museum. How many people were part of the project, and what was like kind of a framework? So also on the book, you mentioned that the chapter are divided in 4. What are the different angles that you also divided the book, and how you look at the project, and what was more related to your own research?
Mm-hmm. I think in general, the main field of our research was that we conducted interviews and we did ethnography in refugee accommodations. And it was not just one accommodation, but we also followed people and tried to understand how their situation developed. That was one part of the research, but the other part of the research was much more focused on the reception facilities, how staff members, how community members of the local communities perceive and judge the presence of refugees, how staff members negotiate cultural differences along things. So I think you have one perspective on migrants and their perspectives, and then a general perspective on the host society. From there, the project also developed in a sense that because there was a pandemic, we could not enter the facilities anymore. And then a colleague of mine started working on material culture and forced migration from a digital anthropology, not just in Germany, but also in the Mediterranean, in the Greek islands, in Turkey and Afghanistan. So it really enlarged the perspective on things.
You collected a couple of stories, objects, and itineraries. How did you collect them, and how did you then select them, and which one did you put on the website, and how many there are?
The main way we collected them was like by ethnographic research. In the frame we were allowed to do it, we were not allowed to stay in the camp to really live there. This is what ethnographers usually do. They go to communities, live there, spend time there. hang out with people in order to understand the context in depth. We had some constraints, but we were making interviews, we were spending time, and that was our main form of collecting ethnographic data. But on the other hand, one could say that because the museum was also part of the project, they were interested in collecting things. But what turned out to be really an obstacle is in comparison to like the older migrants who a couple of decades ago came to Germany and have thought about things and they want to bring things in the museum, is the experience that we're not able to collect very significant things, and also in a broader scale. We collected many stories, but collecting actual things was difficult. First of all, because the things were missing. People lost most of their belongings during flight, when their homes were bombed or they had crossed borders, but also in protected exile. Many lived in very precarious conditions, for example, in Turkey. So it's like keeping things is really a difficult thing in that context. And then on the other hand, and this is what I'm aiming to in my chapter, is also that you have things that are way too important on a personal level to give them to a museum, because there's really an existential bound between the person who possesses the object and the object. You cannot take a cuddly toy and put it into a museum because it will break the heart of a person. So that was the other reason why we did not collect too many things to put them in the museum. But we collected museum stories.
Maybe you can start to talk a little bit about your article and also explain the case study of Zahra and Atiya, and illustrates also what is the relation of object, as you also were mentioning right now.
There were quite many articles showing the possessions of refugees that time, but also you have the classic stories of Palestinians keeping their keys and so on. And of course, there's a component in these sayings, in these stories, that people keep things that are important to them. And what was interesting for me in the two cases was this is a story and a counter story in a certain sense. Atiya is from Salamiyya, which is in Hama province in Syria, and she studied and she worked as a nurse and fled to Turkey. Yeah, and the object we're talking about, Rocky, is a cuddly toy that was made by her mother for her when she was a child out of a jacket. The two have a very intense relationship, and I think it goes beyond human-object relationship in a sense that the cuddly toy Rocky is really humanized and also almost addressed like a human being. And then Zahra, on the other hand, is a classic thing people have. It's like a gift from one of her family members. She had kept and born, but then she had kept it also in exile in her pocket, but in fact she did not use it anymore in everyday life. And then when we interviewed her, it was a bit like a remnant of a former life that was still there, but in a certain way lost its significance or relevance for the person. Atiya, the displacement she faced and the traumatic incidents, she tried to cope with that with sticking to Rocky, this cuddly toy. And this is really an intensifying relation during the migration process. So the thing becomes more and more important for her. On the other hand, you have Zahra and her bangle, where the bangle was a personal gift, but in fact, it was losing a relevance during the migration process, even though it was a gift and it was kept all the time. But when we interviewed her, she had no proper idea what to do about the thing, because it was out fashion. She didn't like it that much anymore, and she didn't want to just throw it away because it was a gift. And then it was a good thing to give it to the museum. It was still a relevant place on the one hand, but she was also, in a certain sense, freed of it. The general lesson is that the relation between people and things transform during biographies, but also during migrations. And we really have to understand how this process goes.
I was also really fascinated by Atiya because the way she took care of the object by fixing the object, for example, used the objects as a way not to feel lonely because she didn't have much family around her, while Zahra The object, of course, it's not a toy, it's more like a metallic object, so it's also hard. But I thought that the relation between that is also the relation between the family too, because Zara was traveling with the family. Also, this idea of with who you're traveling and with who you're going to that place really change your relationship with the object.
Very much. And also the materiality you addressed. If you look at it from the material point of view, then Rocky, the cuddly toy of Atiyah, is in a way, it is decaying because it's used so intensely. But on the other hand, like the relevance for her remains stable, and it is increasing the more desperate she gets, or the more isolated she is, socially speaking. On the other hand, the bangle is metal, and is materially speaking, it remains almost unchanged. You have some scratches and whatever, but is not a drastic change in the object itself, but it loses the social relevance because Zara is making home or traveling with her family. Maybe the two stories are also good in terms of understanding how people make home with things. In Atiyah's case, she's very isolated, and the way she tries to gain stability and a kind of ontological security and familiarity is the relation to Rocky on the one hand, but on the other hand, she's also working very hard and studying very hard in order to, gain stability. And it is not the first time for her that she's doing that in Germany, but the second time. She learned Turkish very well. She studied in Turkey, but then decided to leave for Germany. So it's really, she's focusing on learning. She's socially isolated, and the thing is a kind of anchoring point she can refer to every time. In Zara's case, she's much more independent from the thing, from the object, because first of all, she has her family. Second of all, she also was able to make new friends, even in Germany after a very short time, and she's socially engaged. And then, let's say, the social perspective, how people, the outside, look at the thing is maybe more important than the thing for Zara herself. This is also the reason why she gives it away, because she feels it's out fashioned, it's not that relevant anymore.
I thought that the age was really relevant in the discussion too, because Atina already tried to have two lives basically in Turkey, and then she came to Germany. She tried to get integrated by studying, by getting maybe a higher position, while Zara was still a teenager, and her perception of things was based on what she sees by going probably to school.
And by her peers, as you said.
So in relation to the case study that you just explained, I would like you to talk a little bit about the idea of perceptual horizon, which you talk in your article, what it is and why did you come up with this way of looking at it?
This horizon concept is not new. It was developed by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He's a phenomenologist and philosopher, and it was thinking about the relationship between ourselves and the world, and that the horizon is the frame in which we encounter our environment, in which we receive and sense our environment. So this is basically the understanding that we're not just objective observers, but what we see has to do with how we are positioned as persons and how we interact with the material world and the social world. So this is the basic idea. And what I found to be very interesting in the two cases is that this sense of situated perspective on things is very much what makes a biographical object. So you can employ all the intersectional categories, but of course age and gender and social positioning and all these aspects play a part in terms of how you are related to an object that is of special significance to you, that you share a biographical connection with. I was not satisfied with the intersectional approach in terms of I have all these categories, but then I still have the story, but I wanted to put the perspective and sensation of people in the center of the case studies, because I talk to people and what I describe is their sensation of certain things or the material world. So it was an attempt to bring together the social situatedness with the personal perspective on things. And this is what I try to do with the concept of perceptual horizon.
How can you use this perceptual horizon in the case study of the lockdown that we all been through? So in the relation between home objects and the lockdown?
the lockdown changed our relation to things very dramatically. Of course, for people who don't have homes, for people in reception facilities, the situation was quite devastating because they were prisoned there. They were exposed to the disease and they had no protection. The people I talked to, for them, not much did change during the COVID pandemic because, I don't know, they did what they were doing before. But when I think about my own experience, is that maybe I have developed a kind of biographical relation to my computer because it really became my door to the world in a sense. And I have met so many people just via this screen. And I think that in a sense, when I now reflect on all the events I had on this very writing desk with the book next to me, is really, it changed something, that this place, it was not just my working place, but it really became a door to the world. And when I now think of all the people I met here at this very place, I really feel that changed something in a sense that it changed my perception of the room. And I think this is two-folded in a sense that sometimes I feel I have to get out of here. I cannot stand my room any longer because it's the place where I sleep, it's the place where I work, it's like everything is densified on that room. And on the other hand, it's also a place where I had very interesting engagements, conferences. It's like a biographical place in which the personal experiences of home merge with professional experiences. There's another text in the book by Maruška Svašek in which she was showing how she engaged by making things, like becoming creative, sending people things and starting to make things, and that she developed personal ties via building things. And so maybe the biographical perspective should shift away when it comes to lockdown, but also when it comes to migration, from that you have one specific object and this object travels through different stages, socially speaking or personally speaking, but also in terms of how people create new materials and new things during lockdown, but also during migrations, and relate to certain people. In fact, what many refugees did was also making art and producing art, and they were engaging in museum workshops and they created fascinating pieces. And it is not that you just bring a thing over, but it's also familiarizing yourself in a new environment by the skills you bring along and you apply in a new context. Maybe we should use the biographical approach also, not just looking at things, but also how things are created.
What things are really necessary? Under normal circumstances of life, such a question are rarely asked, but they do refer to fundamental relation to things. This was part of what you wrote in the introduction of the book. And I thought it was really matching with the lockdown because people actually started to think what is necessary to have in the house, which things are necessary, which things do I want to be surrounded, how do I want to use my space, which is also part of the migration, because when you migrate somewhere, you have to also make a selection of what do you want to take with you.
The pandemic and migration, they provide new challenges for people to making a place in the world, a place where they belong. And even though it can be very flexible, it can be very volatile, but still the question is, what are the things you need to, at least for a certain moment or for some time to feel at home and to have a place that somehow fits you or your needs, from which you can gain a certain, we say ontological security, but a sense of home, a sense of security and familiarity and belonging.
What did you learn during the research process, and how do you want to use this knowledge that you gathered for your future work?
What I learned during the research is that, first of all, when we speak of refugees, I talked to so many people, and you cannot believe how many different backgrounds people have. You have very wealthy Iranian families coming for freedom's sake. We have people, who were stuck in Greece under horrible conditions. The differences between people who are labeled refugees is so broad, that was very impressive. And the same goes for their relations with things. What I learned is that we have to take a kind of double perspective, in a sense that it is necessary to reflect on the conditions in which people live, but also at the same time it's also very important to understand the personal relationship to things and the personal relevance, how things matter for people. I really think that bringing the social together with the personal, then critically consider how these ties and perspectives are mediated through things. This is something very powerful. In terms of what I learned for future experiences, I found it to be very interesting that when we in migration studies or in migration anthropology speak of refugees, we often use the term displacement. But I experienced that many people I talk to, they experience dispossessions. It means that they lost things, they lost homes, they lost not only the things that were bombed to rubble, but also the right to determine them or the right to claim them as their own. And I learned that under certain conditions, people can cope with these forms of dispossession and loss. But when people are under very precarious conditions, then these experiences of dispossessions, in a sense, accumulate. They're increasing their personal crisis. And this is something I would love to look at. I really think it is important to look at dispossessions from an object-based perspective. What people actually lose and how these losses that take place forcefully affect their existence, their way of life.
How are you using your living spaces at home and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
I lived a very mobile life as a commuter. I was in the train every week. I was commuting between different German cities. Yeah, and then the pandemic came and I was confined to my home, in a sense. On the one hand, I enjoyed it because I realized how much time I spend on the train and on how much money and so on. There's a lot of energy and time that you spend on traveling, and that you're now on your home. But on the other hand is also you miss so many places, you miss so many different perspectives. Still, this was really something I still miss. I really look forward to be able to travel more. I don't know. There's this saying that in order to find yourself, you should lose yourself by seeing the world, something like that. But I would be looking forward to losing myself in the world a bit more. Yeah, to see more of the world in real.
What type of value do you personally give to objects and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
When I first had my job as a material cultural anthropologist, I was thinking about not taking the position because the idea of focusing on things was really absurd to me and it was not something I wanted. I wanted to talk to people. I was like, I'm becoming an anthropologist. Why should I focus on dead things? Then little I learned about the advantages, but of course also the difficulties of studying objects. This, of course, reflects my personal relation to things. I think I'm quite a pragmatic person. I don't keep many memory objects or the like. When I think about lost relatives, my grandmother who died or whatever, I don't need so much things that remind me of her. What I enjoy is like having a place with people coming together and commemorating by telling stories or the like. I really think that don't need too much things, but what I need is the social interaction in terms of, for example, commemoration. That I think I'm quite flexible. I don't cling to things too much. I don't have a problem with giving away things I don't need or the like.
What does sociable objects mean to you, or what does it make you think the word sociable objects?
Sociable objects, I think it's quite interesting, the relation between the two words, because, and I think maybe I can use this to make a more broader stance on what can an anthropology or research that is focusing on things do. And I think that when we're focusing on things, it can bring people together, because no matter what person you are, whenever you discuss personal belongings or things that are in a certain way relevant to you, you find many similarities between your own perspectives, between other people. You would not by theorizing, summarized under the term refugee, under the term migrant or whatever. It is really this personal relation to things unfolds a broad field of possible relations and bringing people together. So one of my hope is that if you do research on sociable objects, is like it has the capability of bringing people together. On the other hand, I think if used in a wrong way, if you take things as just markers for the other in order to try to embolden racism and stereotypes, then you can use things easily to have a contrary effect, and this is dividing people. So I think that good research is sociable research in terms of using things to bring people together, just in a sense to make them understand each other. That would be the good thing, and the bad thing is if we fail to do good research, or some people do it on purpose, then it is socially dividing. Objects can be turned into tools of creating the social divide.